Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Dr. John Hodson, the director of the Maamaawisiiwin Research and Education Centre. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Steve. Really pleasure being here.
I got to start right away with full disclosure. I met John last year when he was part of an evaluation of a project I was working on that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. But before we do that, let me ask a little bit about your background. Are you a local Thunder Bay boy, or where'd you grow up? Tell me a little bit about your history.
Not local. I'm an import from the south. Haudenosaunee, Kayongiha, or what more popularly would be known as Mohawk. Grew up in southern Ontario, moved up here around 10 years ago, but I've been working in the far north, or the northwestern Ontario, for the last 20 years. I did advanced degrees at 2 universities in the south, finished a PhD at York, did a postdoc in New Zealand with Maori people, worked in 2 faculties of ed, and was a student in a 3rd. And that's how I got up here. I started at working at Lakehead.
So what was your focus on with your PhD?
Aboriginal education, in fact. My interest is in, Maamaawisiiwin has 2 areas of expertise that's sort of connected to my research and my work, my earlier work in my PhD days. What we're trying to do is really have a positive impact on Indigenous education at all levels, whether it's on reserve or off. But the majority of our focus is off-reserve Indigenous education. So what we do primarily is help teachers become better educators of Indigenous kids. Regrettably, faculties of education aren't really doing that. At least they're not being effective. And teachers are very aware of their needs, and they see the lack of success that Indigenous kids have in school, and they really want some help. Teachers are very practical, they're very pragmatic. Never met a teacher that didn't want to do a good job. And thankfully, the work we do up here, we've had a vast number of teachers involved in what we call the Maamaawisiiwin Professional Teacher Development Program. And we see, greater satisfaction with teachers, greater engagement of Indigenous kids, their attendance increases, behavioral issues decrease, grades go up, teacher satisfaction goes up. And so we don't focus on, I said teachers are very pragmatic, they're very practical. They don't, if you get a teacher a binder, they just, they don't have time to go through things. So we work with them one-on-one and help them become better educators. And we focus primarily on pedagogy, or what we say indigegogy, which is how to teach kids.
So pedagogy is how to teach kids?
It's the dominant society's approach to teaching of children. It's become pretty generic now that it's not only talking about teaching children, but adults as well. But we say that Indigenous kids need a distinctly different approach to teacher education or teachers. And so we call it indigegogy, Indigenous goji.
So tell me a little bit about that unique approach and why. Why is that different?
Oh, that's a good question, Steve. When I finished my PhD and my dissertation, you write a book essentially. What I had done was I talked to literally every group of kids involved in education across the province that I could, that I was able to. So I talked to inner city Inuit kids in downtown Ottawa. I talked to Haudenosaunee kids. I talked to Anishinaabe kids, Mushkego kids, kids that were from flying communities, Métis kids from Métis settlements. And all I said was, tell me about your education. And what I found through those circles and those conversations, those narratives that we collected of those kids, was basically the same story that I had, or the same experience that I had 50 years before. So what I had sort of concluded was nothing had really changed in education, and that those kids were suffering accordingly. And you look at the dropout rates in this province. 2016 census said that 65% of the kids 15 to 24 will not have a grade 12 education.
Now say that again. 50%?
65%.
65%?
Yeah, of all children, Indigenous children, the province of Ontario, between the age of 15 and 24, will not complete high school or equivalent.
Well, and we know that is such a significant predictor of future health, employment, engagement in all kinds of parts of society. Like, how can this be? 65% don't graduate high school.
Yeah. How can it be? Well, I mean, if you want to trace it back to faculties of education that have yet to move to help teachers pick up a different pedagogy or indigedagogy. In this province, in this territory especially, most of the schools, elementary schools, in city schools in Thunder Bay are at minimum 50. Most of them are at 70, 80% Indigenous. Westgate, for instance, high school, is I think 30, 35% Indigenous. 1/3 of the kids there are Indigenous. Across the Northwest and the 8 school boards, I think something like 9,000 kids are Indigenous at the top end, that are either living in an urban center like Kenora, for instance, and then going to urban schools, or being bussed in, from close reserves into urban schools. So you start projecting, and don't forget that 1 in 5 kids in this country is Indigenous. We're the highest some of the highest birth rates in the country. You start projecting some of these realities across the board, and it's not difficult to see that one of the social outcomes of that is homelessness. Another outcome of that is incarceration. So the local jail, provincial jail in town, is the female population, I think, is 90% Indigenous. And if you look at the research right across the country, provincially, territorially, federally, the thing that they have in common is that young people are going into incarceration without a grade 12 education. Makes sense. You're right. Without a grade 12 education, you can't go into employment training. You can't go into college. You can't go into into university. There are very few employment opportunities. You can't flip a hamburger, in town without a grade 12 education. So those kids drop out as soon as they can. They're on the streets. That's another form of education. And the outcome of that is they go to jail. I read a recent report that said 49% of the incarcerated population in this country is Indigenous. We represent 5% of the overall population. Are we criminally minded? Are we criminally insane? No. What we have is a whole bunch of socioeconomic, sociocultural realities that limit our opportunities in the future. And our kids are key to that. So that's why we're so focused on that population. The more kids we can keep in school, the less kids that are going to be on the street, the less kids that are going to be involved in drugs and alcohol, the less kids that are going to be involved in criminal activity. It's as simple as that. And I think the last thing I read from the province of Ontario, the Attorney General, I think it's the Attorney General, was keep one kid out of jail, you save the population $1.5 million, $2 million. So, let's not invest downstream. Let's invest upstream and do everything we can in this province to keep Indigenous kids in school. And the primary people the people that are most significant to do that are teachers. So let's help teachers, but let's help them when they want to be helped, and that's what we do. So we don't concentrate on histories like residential schools or the 60s scoop, those kinds of sad realities that are real, right, and have an impact on Indigenous people. We give teachers what they want. We focus on how teachers can teach our children.
John, we need to hold it right there. We're going to take a short break. Please stay with us, and we'll find out more about how we can help teachers do a better job for all their students. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Dr. John Hodson, the director of the Maamaawisiiwin Research and Education Centre. Welcome back, John.
Thank you, sir.
So we're really talking about, in a way, the challenges that teachers have in helping their Indigenous students to be successful.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, that's set in a larger context of a teacher having 20, 30 or more students at one time, which would freak me out, how to keep going with all these.
Yep.
And I know in my own experience, 2 of my kids had trouble in school in one way or another. And it was it seemed to me, because of our intervention as parents, that they didn't get put into a class of slow kids, as they would have called it back in the day. And now they're successful in their own chosen paths. But it took that, it took me kind of going, I know my son. I know he's got skills. He's got some issues, but let's work through it, or else he would have been accepted as not going to be successful. So within that context, what can you do? What kind of help can you give to teachers to help them with other students that need something a little bit different?
That's a really good question, and really connected to the work we do. Let me go back to my dissertation work, and when I talked to all those kids across the province, what I found was that kids told the same story. It didn't matter if they were out of a fly-in community, or if they lived in downtown Hamilton or downtown Ottawa, they all told the same story. And when they said, what do you want from teachers? They were very clear and I was dealing with kids that were from rough circumstances, and they were smart, they were thoughtful, they were very clear on what they want from teachers. And we took that, and there were 7 points that they wanted teachers to be and how they wanted teachers to be with them. And we created an effective teachers profile, which is the basis for this work that we do. We call the professional development program. We teach teachers to bring that into their practice. And it's done privately, it's done confidentially. When we work with school boards, we're not talking to school boards or principals. We work with teachers on a voluntary basis, and they control how much they bring into their practice and how much they don't. We observe them in class, we sit with them and say, here's what we saw, here's what we didn't see, and then we tracked the effectiveness of that by teacher engagement, how often kids were engaged in classrooms, not on cell phones, for instance, or what was their grade, their final grade versus their first grade. What was their attendance? How many days were they there? How many days were they not there? And what we found was that, most importantly, teachers became more satisfied with their work. They felt they were doing something important in their work and having a positive impact on the kids. And what we saw with the kids was, and we always say this, all the good stuff went up and all the bad stuff went down. And that's available. That report's actually available on our website, and we'll give you a link to that to have a look at it. It's very clear from the statistical analysis on the impact. We didn't do that kind of work alone. After I finished my PhD, I learned about a program in New Zealand with Maori. It should be no surprise that the current contemporary reality of Indigenous people in Canada is the same in the United States, in Central America, South America, New Zealand, Australia. And the reason is that colonization had the same impact on all the people. I like to say the colonization playbook was pretty limited. And so they just kept replicating it over. They had residential schools in New Zealand and Australia, and those were pretty much the colonial tactic or tool that kind of ripped the rug out from underneath everybody. So I went to New Zealand. I worked with these Maori people for a year that were doing the same thing. I had the Canadian context, but I didn't have how to do it, right? How to put it into action. So I worked with Maori at the University of Waikato in a program called Teiko Tekitanga. In Maori, that means everybody's sort of moving in the same direction. And they work with teachers in the same way that we did. So I worked with them for a year, learned how to use their program. They were very generous to me, and brought it back to Canada and plugged in the Canadian or the Ontario needs into that program. And that was the basis for the program that we offer now. We're in the process, hopefully, with the change in government, priorities changed in terms of the Ministry of Education. When we piloted it, it was funded by the ministry, but again, agendas change. So we have another application for funding, but at the federal level. We were lucky enough to bring together a really solid group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations in town to make this collaborative application. We got through the LOI process. I think it was a national call for proposals. There was 300 and change, and we were one of the 11% that were asked to do a full proposal. So we should hear about that in the next few months, and if that's the case, then we'll launch it again in town, at a high school in town. I won't identify it at this point because it's still up in the air, but we'll make sure you know when the time comes.
So are there little tips or techniques that you can share of something that a teacher could do that would actually make a difference for the pupils that they're working with?
I think the simplest one is engaging those kids, talking to them. What you see in classrooms for the most part is there's a lack of relationship between the teachers and the kids. The greatest predictor of success, school success for Aboriginal kids, are the teachers that work with them, right? So if teachers feel inadequate to work with those kids sort of fade into the background. And like me, when I was in school, I sat in the back row and just hid, I didn't go to university until I was 40. And frankly, I didn't go to university because I thought I was, well, what we'd say now, cognitively impaired and was unable to do it. I fell into university and I discovered that, in fact, it was the other way around. So what I discovered was I didn't fail school, school failed me. So in 10 years, I did an undergrad, a grad, and a PhD, and worked full-time while I was doing it. So it's not that our kids can't do it, it's just that we don't have our teachers that are properly educated to work with our kids. So, okay, engage kids on a one-on-one basis. Don't dumb down the work, for kids because they're Indigenous. Kids know things are being dumbed down, Allow kids to make their own decisions, but hold them to their decisions. So if a kid says, yeah, I'm going to have it in at such and such a time, or I want to do this thing on hip hop or, skater culture or whatever, right? Allow them to do it, explore their world. Don't dictate so readily, what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. How do we create kids that are self-determining? And I don't care if they're, what color their skin is. If you don't allow kids to make their own decisions and be held to those decisions. Kids will make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Those are opportunities for learning. Those are just a couple of, ideas that we work intently with teachers on, intensely rather, and help them shift their practice.
Education is such an important part of our society, and it's also controversial.
Yep.
And we have some people that say education should be about preparing you for a job, and others that education is more about being really full participants in society. And curriculums can really vary based on that. It seems like in Ontario we're kind of halfway between those two. I'm going to come back to you right after the break, but we got to take another short break.
Sure. And
kind of look at really that overall direction of our education. Please stay with us and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Dr. John Hodson, the director of the Maamaawisiiwin Research and Education Centre. So, in a way, we're talking about really the purpose of education, and how that is foundational really to success in society. From your technique and your angle, you talk about engaging kids kind of where they're at.
Yep.
How does that fit into that bigger debate around the purpose of education?
Well, now I'm going to be critical of education. We still haven't come to terms with the notion that, and I mean at the level of teacher education, that there's more than one way to teach, right? Teaching, as we understand it in Western society, is very teacher-centered, and teachers, for the most part, teach by rote. That's the unfortunate thing. So by the time a teacher hits their certification years, it's now 2 years in the province of Ontario, they literally have 14,000 hours of watching teachers teach. Now, these people are at the top of their game. They were very successful in elementary and high school, and when they did their 4-year undergraduate degree, and now they're accepted into teacher education for 2 years. They know how education works. They know how to teach by virtue of being taught. 14,000 hours. I defy anyone to come up with another profession that has that much absolute observation, right, where the next generation of teachers come in. You don't see that in judges or lawyers or doctors Or the only other thing I can think of that's close to it is parenting. You parent based on how you were parented, right? That's just an absolute.
That's the starting place.
Exactly. So what we want to see is across the province is let's stop retrofitting teachers with programs like ours. Let's start seeing faculties of education really delve into and help teachers unpack that 14,000 hours, right, of observing teachers teach. And through that process of unpacking and making what they don't actively recall more upfront, then they'll start understanding what needs to be done in a different way. I think what we need in this province and in the whole country are teachers that literally teach bi-pedagogically. They are pedagogues, but they're also indigigods, and they can flip back and forth depending on the needs. Now, here's what the Maori research talks about in this program that I was involved in. Not only was the work that they did, Teiko Tekitanga, with teachers, good for Maori kids, what they found was it was good for all kids. Because you improve a teacher's practice, they teach better for all kids. Doesn't matter what color they are or what kind of socioeconomic background they're in. They teach differently and improve. So as Maori standardized test scores, for instance, increased, guess what? So did non-Maori test scores increase. So it's not about just helping Indigenous kids, it's literally helping all kids. Now, as an example, and I don't know your children, and I don't know the history in detail, but it sounds to me very similar in that you had highly intelligent kids that weren't engaged in school because, for whatever reason, school, curriculum, teachers weren't engaging them, and they were bored, right? But you hung in there, you advocated for your kids, and your kids were there, and by you making a fuss, that gets attention, and teachers try harder, right? Principals try harder, and don't sort of marginalize your kids out the edge. And as kids get marginalized in the edge of classrooms, they literally get marginalized eventually out the door of the school. So you're a classic example of that, right? The difference is you advocated for your kids. You don't see that a lot from Indigenous parents. And one of the things you hear from teachers quite a bit is, please, we never see teachers here in parent-teacher night. They don't come. Well, what we understand is, and what we have seen in Thunder Bay, and there's some really interesting and positive things going on in Thunder Bay around teacher education, or teaching and Indigenous kids. Think of Kingsway Public School, the Learning Academy there. What we saw there were, because they had this different approach to curriculum, where they brought in non-traditional teachers, and they combined mainstream and Indigenous curriculum, we saw kids that were out of tough circumstances more engaged, better grades, parents more engaged in schools. Just the environment of that school, walk in the door, and it's a different vibe, right? Sorry, 60s term. But a different kind of environment, a different kind of feeling. And it's more proof to us that it's possible to do these things. The problem is, A, funding, right? These things cost money, but I'm going to say you save money by not putting people in jail, right? I think it's $2 million a year. Let's invest upstream. Let's invest in things like the Kingsway. Let's invest in helping teachers become more capable and responsible and better at working with our children. And that's what they ask for. You know, the teachers are fed up when we talk to them with professional development that concentrates on histories and residential school and the 60s scoop. That's not what they want. Again, pragmatic, these are practical people. Tell us, and they always say to us, tell us how do you teach your kids. And that's what we do.
So we just have a couple of minutes left.
Sure.
I want to touch back on, yes, the evaluation you did for a project we did with our New Direction Speaker School, the Indigenous Friendship Centre, and the Thunder Bay Shelter House. And when we got everyone together last month and talked about it, the people at Shelter House were going, they all remember the facilitator.
Yeah.
And the facilitator, my memory was that she was open.
Yep.
And that was the big key, that she didn't have, this is what you have to learn. What did you find in that evaluation about that program? What were a couple of the highlights that we can cover in a minute or so?
Okay, I want to connect this work in a couple of ways to what I was talking about previously. This is the other end of the spectrum. the vast majority of the people that participated in this program were Indigenous. And they either came from, remote communities into Thunder Bay, or they were living in Thunder Bay and for one reason or another became homeless. So again, it's connected to school success. The other thing that we loved about this project was it was a de-siloing approach. So New Direction Speaker School was, the funder, the one who received the funding from, I'm going to say Trillium. But it also brought together other groups of organizations like Shelter House and like the Friendship Center, the Thunder Bay Indigenous Friendship Center. And through that process, developed this program that was there every week for 14 weeks, and a fantastic young woman who became the absolute heart of this program. And when we sat down with the participants in that program and talked to them, they were not only stunned by the effectiveness of it, but it started to get them to see things differently. And literally, they talked about hope. They talked about things like feeling normal. They talked about these kinds of notions that are so fundamental to the homeless population. We've got to start thinking in this city where the homeless population is off the charts. We've got to start thinking differently. This is kind of the first step, we believe, this kind of programming.
I got to stop you there. We're out of time, John. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I think we have to have you back and talk about these issues further. Thanks so much for watching. Please stay safe, and we'll see you again next week.